Thank you to the ICD and to Mark for inviting me. Working for a Swiss bank, we pride ourselves in confidentiality, so I'm quite glad that you spelled it USB, actually that's hides us behind it.
UBS.
You said UBS, that's it, so that's okay. Now UBS, just in case you don't know, it's a bank, we have 60,000 employees in over 50 countries, so just to put that into some context. But I'll start with something else. This conference and the sibling conference happening downstairs, as we well know, are closely tied up with the commemorations of the fall of the Berlin Wall. And as you know, as I just said, I work for a large bank, and I've done so for nearly 12 years, but my career actually started in academia. So actually, in a way of a mini anniversary, 20 years ago, almost to the day, my first academic paper was published, and it actually was on the topic of Spanish and Portuguese wolfram, or as people call it mostly tungsten, and Nazi Germany's war effort. So, maybe a long way away from banking. This was a part of my doctoral thesis on the economic relations between Nazi Germany and Francoist Spain. Now, why do I mention this? I think it's in the context of the event that we're commemorating, which takes me a bit down memory lane, because I started my thesis at the very time, almost at the very moment in that autumn that the Berlin Wall came down. Now, I was not in Berlin, I was actually at Oxford University, but still, it was a momentous event. I think the second point here is, when I look at sustainability, I usually look at it through the mind and the eyes of a historian. So history in some ways forms the basis of what I look at. And I think the third thing is actually the topic of this paper that I published 20 years ago, wolfram or tungsten, of which I have been reminded repeatedly in recent months and the last 1 or 2 years. Now, I don't want to venture into memory lane too often, although we do commemorate the 25th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, but I think at this point I do. And I'll start with a little story about, history, we don't know. 1990, 1991, the following story circulated in Oxford. A graduate student working on either, we don't know, a master or doctoral thesis submitted his full draft to the supervisor, only to be told to make some substantive changes, notably to the title, the introduction, and the final chapter. The topic of the thesis was, believe it or not, why the reunification of the two Germanys is never going to happen. The final chapter highlighted the stability of the GDR regime. So, of course, history had overtaken the student and his topic. Now, the story is probably an urban legend, though, considering how few people believed that the GDR regime would fall even in the summer of 1989, maybe it's not an urban legend. But I think what it shows is that historians should not, and rarely do, venture into predicting the future from past developments. We leave that to economists. But maybe, to excuse both historians and economists, the student was a political scientist, and we don't know, they do. With this caveat in mind, as a historian, I do want to venture eventually into some predictions about the whole topic that I'm going to look at. Now, let me jump to the wolfram or tungsten topic. Little could I have foreseen that 20 years later, this raw material, I'm not sure how many of you are aware of this, would become a part of a major discussion around sustainability and responsibility. And I refer to the ongoing discussion around conflict minerals. Let me give you, if you haven't followed this, kind of an insight or a short introduction into this pretty critical subject matter. We'll start with the US, and then that gets us very much into the whole regulatory context. Recently, the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, adopted a rule mandated by the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act to require companies publicly to disclose their use of conflict minerals originating from the Democratic Republic of Congo and any adjoining countries, and there are about 11 or 12. It applies to companies that use minerals, and there are 4 of them: tantalum, tin, gold, and the aforementioned tungsten. Under the final rule, issuers are required to file for the same period, that is a calendar year, regardless of when their fiscal year ends. So what I'm talking about, the first reports, the disclosure, has actually been happening in 2014. Now the EU is now following suit The discussions are still ongoing, but it's again about a system to create, in this case, self-certification for importers dealing in the very same minerals. And this follows, and there is a third body that comes in, so we have the US, the EU, now we have the OECD. This follows the OECD due diligence guidance on the very same matter, which basically requires companies to have due diligence around this. You know, we're talking about smelters, refiners, and so on. Now, why is this an important example? Well, first of all, it does relate very much to the non-governmental in my title, because of course non-governmental organizations have been and continue to pressure very strongly to include, to make companies commit to this, that is, commit to, in this case, ultimately the topic of human rights. Secondly, of course, it leads us to the increasing level of regulation as far as business is concerned. What's that got to do with me working for a bank? That's, of course, an obvious question. So, because the conflict minerals topics, when you look at the US, as the first example, is particularly relevant for electronics companies, for instance. And when you look at it, by the beginning of June of this year, about 1,300 companies already had to submit their filings with the SEC around the topic of conflict minerals. But this is, and just to highlight the point, this is a major societal topic, in particular the topic of human rights. And it also includes a mineral which is relevant to a bank, and that is, of course, gold. Not the tantalum, not the tin, not the wolfram, but the gold. Now, let me explain the context of where that comes into my work, going back to 1999. To remind you, in 1999, January 1999, Kofi Annan, then UN General Secretary, gave a speech to the WEF, to the World Economic Forum, which became the foundation to what we now call the UN Global Compact. What he said is basically to give companies, to create something that gives a human face to globalization. That's his word. Now, UBS followed suit. We were among the first companies to actually sign the Global Compact in 2000 when it was officially launched. And of course, the Global Compact today is the largest corporate responsibility initiative, that's how the UN calls it, in the world, with thousands of companies having signed up to it. And here we are talking about human rights, labor rights, the environment, and of course, since 2004, not from the beginning, anti-corruption. What did that mean for us? It meant in the first place that the bank established a so-called Corporate Responsibility Committee in 2001, so following those whole discussion. This is, at our bank, it's a board of directors committee. It's chaired by the chairman. Currently, that's Axel Weber, formerly chairman of the German Bundesbank. He's the chairman of our bank, so that's just the link between the two. This corporate responsibility committee very quickly looked into the various areas. So what do we do around corporate responsibility as a bank? And one of the topics that they very quickly decided to act on was the topic of non-governmental organizations. So what they did is they actually established a function that would look at monitoring the activities of non-governmental organizations and actually communicating with the very NGOs that have an interest in banks or banks topics. I actually became that function in 2000, at the end of 2003. And gold, to close the loop, was actually one of the very first topics I looked into. And I didn't look into that for the bank, but actually it was a topic that was increasingly relevant to some of our clients. And that, in that sense, of course, it's also relevant to us. And this was actually, and you can look it up on that on the internet. That was actually the so-called Oxfam America so-called Valentine Day campaign of 2004. Have a look at that. It's a very striking example of an NGO campaign with campaigners dressed up as what they called Goldzilla, Goldzilla walking up and down Fifth Avenue to highlight, the human rights and environmental aspects that are related to gold. What it meant for me is, when you look at NGO topics, you basically get an introduction to the whole host of topics that NGOs look at in a very short period of time. And at the time, this coincides with what the NGOs call their Colle Vecchio Declaration, which is the NGOs actually put what I would call a stake into the ground as regards banks. That is, what they said is that we now will look increasingly at the role of banks when it comes to these particular topics. I'll give you an example, classic case study. Some of you may have looked at that, maybe from a university angle. Brent Spar, Shell, mid-1990s, Greenpeace. When you look back at that, and we're not going to describe the case, but when you look back at that, there was not a single bank involved in that campaign. Greenpeace did not care about banks. All it cared about is to get Shell to change its approach when it came to Brent Spar. This is absolutely impossible today. So there is a defining moment about 10, 12, 13 years ago where from when on, we more and more have NGOs looking also at the companies financing the respective project or company. And in a sense, including those banks or other financial institutions in their campaigning. My interaction with NGOs built up gradually. And at the beginning, very slowly, simply because our bank had basically got itself out of what is commonly called project finance a few years before. And at that point, project finance, which is basically the direct financing of projects, building of dams, building of power stations, and so on, was still the key focus of NGOs when it came to banks. Well, we were not involved in that, so we didn't really come into the discussion. But of course, when you look at the next 10 years, that is until today, the focus of the NGOs has widened continuously. That is what it means today for banks, is that NGOs basically campaign against particular projects or companies, and they campaign against the banks that are supposedly involved in this in whatever shape or form. So not just project finance, it can be any form of financing that is deemed in some ways to be linked to that particular project or company. The range of topics that I mentioned has increased massively too. I mentioned at the beginning, one of the first topics that I looked at was gold. When you look at it today, and just to give you some example, and that is sort of reiteration of the topic, commodity chains, controversial weapons, and you may have seen in the newspapers, there's just been a report out on the whole topic of financing of nuclear weapons, deforestation, a huge topic, so that whole topic that is linked to the whole topic of palm oil. The largest topic of all is, of course, climate change, and particularly coal, coal mining, coal-fired power stations, food speculation, land grabbing, human rights, animal welfare, unconventional oil and gas, that is Arctic drilling, shale gas. I think the only thing, although I've seen that on one list, the only thing that I've never been confronted with is liberalizing cannabis, but I think everything else I've seen, over those years. And of course, the methods that NGOs use has widened. Not surprisingly, and of course, we're looking at the age of technology, and it was the previous speaker, very strongly referred to that. The whole use of social media, that's of course created a massive change in the campaigning, so-called shitstorms and so on. But I think also what we see now, gradually the use of legal or quasi-legal avenues. That's a very recent development used by NGOs to actually use the sort of legal road to in the campaigning. This alongside, of course, all the traditional methods that NGOs have always used, the direct campaigning, the flooding your fax machines with pictures, and so on. Finally, and of course this is the key thing here, and the legal topic gets you there, is of course getting government or supranational bodies to regulate. The most important avenue of all. Getting government or supranational bodies, getting government to regulate, or getting supranational bodies to create norms and standards that would change the direction. When I say supranational, the EU representing governments, but of course the UN and the OECD as particularly important examples. When you go back 10 years, there's a classic example around the topic, and that was the failed establishment of the so-called UN norms on the responsibilities of transnational corporations and other business enterprises with regard to human rights. I have to read this because it's such a long title. Of course, that failed. It didn't happen, but it's a good example of 2003 as a first attempt to create a kind of a major norm around the topic of business and human rights. Of course, today we're there. We have the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, and there are further developments that are going to happen. And all of these developments, even though they don't mention banks explicitly, they of course refer to business, so they include banks too, and the banks have a particular role in these developments because quite often the topics are not ours directly. You can put 100 coal-fired power stations into one bank like ours, you won't get there's no comparison of the CO2 emissions, so it's not the bank itself. The whole discussion is usually about the bank's client relations, the bank's transactions. I'll give you a few key examples just to put the context around this, around governmental expectations on key corporate sustainability or corporate responsibility topics. The EU CSR strategy, which actually, I suppose, in some ways finished in 2014, but of course there will be a follow-up to that the discussions are happening this year. Switzerland, the country that I'm based in, is working on its own CSR strategy, so I think we'll see that at the beginning of 2015, and of course there are similarities, not surprisingly, there are similarities between the two strategies. It's about favoring sustainable growth, sustainable employment. In the EU strategy there are 8 areas. I mean, for instance, the whole area of disclosure of social and environmental information. National action plans on business and human rights. So the UN is basically the UN guiding principles are being translated by governments. The latest example is the US. The US is now developing a national action plan on business and human rights. So there are a number of developments. I think another one where NGOs are pretty strongly influenced involved is the strengthening of national contact points. That is the OECD structure in each of the countries. So in that sense, there is a clear connection between what governments are increasingly doing in the space of sustainability or corporate responsibility and the activities of NGOs. And of course, that's not surprising, because when you look at the numbers, there is clearly an obvious reason for the NGOs to put that kind of pressure on government to act. They look at the increase of population size, the using up of planets. I mean, you look at the WWF numbers, the burning of what is currently $2.5 trillion of US dollars of natural capital every year. So all of these numbers clearly underline why there is more and more pressure by NGOs on governments to act. So to conclude all of that, and just to give another flavor on the banking side, I think many of these issues, and I think that's still not recognized by people outside the direct groups affected. Many of these issues are moving from niche to mainstream. So when it may have been in the past a relationship between an NGO and a particular company, we're now talking about something that is translated by government, look at the SEC rules, by government for a large number of companies, not just for one single or a few companies. So there is a co-creation of baseline standards where NGOs are involved with the OECD, the guiding principles, etc., etc. We believe potentially, it may not be that long off until a fundamental principle of banking, that is fiduciary duty, may also be reconsidered in this regard and broadened to also include impact, not just risk and return. Secondly, the issues are here to stay for the long term. So essentially, and this again relates back to the previous speaker, we are entering a new industrial revolution, whatever shape or form it is. We're re-engineering our society, and of course, therefore, there will be more government action. For banks, engagement is not an option. I think we are sort of somewhere at the end of the food chain, because a lot of it affects other companies first. But I think it ultimately means that you need to be involved. You need to be proactive. We do that in various ways, in various shapes or forms, to provide our expertise and our knowledge. I mean, remember, large banks like us, we have dealings with all industrial sectors out there. So when you look at our people doing environmental and social risk management, they actually have knowledge of the risks faced by each industrial sector that's out there. I think that's not something you won't find in any other sector of the economy other than large banks. And ultimately, I think the key thing is, and that needs to come out very strongly, this is not solely about risk. And a lot of this seems to be about risk, because we're talking about preventing certain things from happening. I think it is also about reward. A lot of these measures are also about incentivizing certain behaviors, not about sanctioning. There was an interesting study, just as the last point, by the Federal Reserve Bank, documenting more than 250 macro-prudential measures during the 20th century to direct credit to certain sectors. So measures that would make sure that money gets to where it should go. This may be returning, but it may be returning with a particular focus on these societal problems that we're faced with. And of course that, again, will lead to a major change in the way that banking is going to shape itself in the forthcoming years. Thank you.